Thank you. You flatter me. I did give a paper, was it last year or the year before? And exactly in the same place, or maybe a bit further over. John Robarts and his wife were sitting there. And if you ever want to give a paper, have them sit right in front of you. They are the best listeners. Makes you feel very good. I must express my gratitude to the powers that be for placing me on the same day as Dorothy and James Nelson. Their presentation has relieved me of the burden of explaining where I'm coming from. The Nelsons have placed us, the Baha'i faith, in the field of jurisprudence with a scholarly and rigorous paper. We know now where we stand in that field. Now we can deal with the hows and whys of law, and most importantly, of law is international law. Let me then put a question to you that I hope will be answered in half an hour from now. How does the Baha'i faith assert its influence on the world of practical law? The Nelsons said that the Baha'i faith has the power of authority. So where and how do we establish this fact as Baha'is? How does the world know this? The world today doesn't recognize that fact, the divine authority with which we speak. How does the Baha'i faith distinguish itself and win people's allegiance for practical law? How do we prove that we have God's words and God's justice? In this paper, I deal with two things. First, I look at the idea of human rights. What is a human right anyway? I'll leave that with you. And second, I look at the history of human rights in international law with a mind to what causes men to recognize rights and what must come about before human rights are enjoyed in reality. I say look at instead of a more commanding term as study, examine. Because I'm a philosopher at heart. And no philosopher worth his name admits to doing anything more than merely looking at an issue. This paper is more philosophy, more a savoring of the idea, I suppose, than it is a rigorous legal study. That said, by way of warning to those of you who are legal scholars, and by way of encouragement to those of you who are idea men, fellow students in metaphor, let's begin. Alexander Pope, I open up my paper with his essay on man. He writes, "Know then thyself, presume not God to scan, the proper study of mankind is man, placed on this isthmus of a middle state, of being darkly wise and rudely great, with too much knowledge for the skeptic side, with too much weakness for the stoic's pride. He hangs between, in doubt to act or rest, in doubt to deem himself a god or beast." A right is not an abstract, holy, mysterious kind of thing. It's very real, tangible, and analyzable. Human rights are bestowed by men, on the grounds of what men think themselves to be. If you want to write anything down about this paper, write that sentence down. Human rights are bestowed by men, on the grounds of what men think themselves to be. That's the essence of what I want to say today. That's all I want to say today. I wrote that sentence and I just wanted to leave the paper, but I worked it out and I would have had to say it 180 times to fill up half an hour. The human rights are bestowed by men, on the grounds of what men think themselves to be. The point is that human rights are themselves not God-given or naturally evident. They don't exist unless men practice them. They are exactly what men contract among themselves to do. Men do not have to obey law. Get into a dangerous bunch of questions there. They don't have to obey law. They do not have to recognize anyone's rights. For even the lowliest individual has the power to break a law. It does not matter that sanctions may be applied after the fact, after the crime is committed. For law to work, it must prevent the act. It must act before sanctions, before the penalty, the sending the fellow to jail. There must be a spirit behind the law which induces men to obey it, make them willing to obey it and to recognize rights. So, I'll read that sentence again. No, I won't. While it may be God or nature that makes human rights desirable or good, human rights are not bestowed or practiced by these forces, since human rights have been, are, and perhaps always will be, abrogated by men. The kind of law that exists, the kind of spirit which exists behind a law, which makes men willing to obey it before sanctions are applied, this is the kind of law that exists in nation states, maybe even between nation states on a regional basis. The reason men willingly and voluntarily obey certain standards of behavior is that they share a common notion of what is good, what is just, what is unjust. A bunch of like minds, they can all share in that spirit of law. They share a common culture. Visions of what man is and what is conducive to his betterment are ultimately founded on religious traditions. It is in religions that ideas of truth and human nature are amalgamated and wed to social practice. There is no problem where people of different religious persuasions can avoid one another, but when forced into interaction with different religions, equally determined in their beliefs, men must work out some compromise. For example, and here's a historical example, with the Reformation and the wars of religion, there were occasional situations where partisans of one faith found themselves living within the territorial limits of a prince belonging to a different confession. You had Protestant subjects and a Catholic prince, and vice versa. This dilemma demanded a more inclusive claim to authority than one based on a single religious doctrine. And therefore, the notion of a human being, the notion of human rights, began to be secularized. That is to say, the standards by which you gave human rights was drawn away from your religious persuasion to a secular world. And then you have the Treaty of Augsburg in 1555. This is pretty good scholarship, isn't it? 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia. All treaties which started to formulate the idea of religious minority rights. Certain very limited human rights became the duties of sovereignty because it was seen as dangerous to international peace to violate such rights. The basis of the definition of human rights had become secularized among Western nations anyway, by economic and political necessity, into a principle of recognizing the rights of minorities regardless of their specific belief. But with the secularization came a problem. Who defines now what rights are? In a religiously monolithic society, the pronouncement of the prevailing church was accepted. The religious hierarchy was the authoritative source for adapting standards to new situations. But now, with the authority for interpreting and enforcing rights left to the nation state, who had only some vague religious mandate, human rights became a tool of power politics. The idea of human rights was an idea made possible by religion, because religion provides the standards of human behavior. But when the authority of the church was undermined, when the nation state became the authority for deciding and bestowing human rights became a muddled affair. The theory behind human rights was still very principled. It's a good thing to have human rights. But in practice, the idea of human rights became as unprincipled as those charged with upholding human rights, namely the nation state. And that led to a bout of humanitarian interventions, as they were called. Interventions of one state into another on the grounds of humanitarian causes. There's some problems with these, however, because the notions which these countries operated under, their definition of what was good and bad, was isolated to that country. So whoever was most powerful intervened using the laudable rhetoric of human rights for their own political expedience. one international lawyer, reviewing some of the cases of humanitarian intervention in the 19th century, points out three very interesting points. That the intervening powers always acted in concert. Their joint motive, Muslim Turkey being the target government, was ostensibly Christian. Number two, in the long run, the results of humanitarian intervention have always been political. Though the protection of human rights was the pretext, the situation to be remedied was a political one. And three, the humanitarian interventions of the 19th century were arbitrary, transient, and without continuing authority. Green also condemns the humanitarian interventions of the 19th century as more political than idealistic. The record of the 19th century shows that humanitarian intervention as a policy was only of value when resorted to by a stronger power against a weaker one. So humanitarian intervention was only viable in the 1800s, or 1900s, 18th century, 20th century, 19th century, 1800s. And that's right. It was only possible when one ideology, the Western or Judeo-Christian one, enjoyed political preeminence in the world. But as developing countries took on more importance, and the West power became increasingly dependent on the willing assent of lesser states, third world states, intervention became less acceptable or practical. Probably because such intervention would have to be more humanitarian than political if it was to be accepted. So by the 20th century, that's what we're in now, I'll get that one straight, there was evident in state practice a backsliding from the former willingness to intervene on humanitarian grounds. And even on religious grounds, there seemed to be no desire to tie respect for human rights to either the law of nations or nature. I'm going through the history of human rights. Today, the principle of nation-state sovereignty is placed before that of human rights in the 20th century. But also today, as in all other epochs, the idea of human rights is accepted and sought after. Everyone thinks human rights are good. But we're not willing to sacrifice nation-state sovereignty. We're not willing to allow one country to intervene into another. This means that the chore before writers on human rights is not to invent definitions of human rights and attempt to oppose them on a nation-state, but rather to encourage states, force states, to define themselves the human rights they can abide by, and move them to establish a covenant amongst themselves to collectively enforce such rights. You can look at Secret of Divine Civilization, page 64, for what Abdu'l-Baha says about that. Human rights will become a reality when the perceptions and attitudes of nation-states are changed, since it is only with the consent of a nation-state that its sovereign status could change. The task that has been before modern man for the last half-century has been to establish, then, real and forcible human rights, but without compromising the more important principle of nation-state sovereignty. This endeavor, though yet to bear fruit, has been in effect the mandate of the United Nations. And then in the paper I go into a somewhat tedious survey of the UN documents concerning human rights, and concluding with a real-life example which shows where we are exactly, rhetoric aside, what kind of human rights do we enjoy today. The essence of my survey of the UN human rights documents is that while they're all very laudable, and in principle and pronouncement, no document goes beyond nation-state sovereignty in practice. That is to say, while each nation-state is bound by its very membership even in the United Nations to uphold human rights and human dignity, the enforcement of this duty of the nation-state is left up to the nation-state itself. This is somewhat like the spelling tests you were allowed to correct yourself in school, the ones you always cheated on. And in this case, the teacher cannot check on your honesty. There is no authority above the individual nation-state for his own performance. There's many covenants and declarations and the Charter of the UN itself, very laudable in their words, and yet each country, though they sign that, they themselves are the judge of how they perform. The attempt to have both an enforceable human right and nation-state sovereignty has, therefore, resulted in agreement in principle by all nation-states to enforce human rights. But the crucial element of practice and enforcement is left up to the individual state. That agreement in principle is not enough to make human rights a reality is clear in the example of the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran by the present Iranian regime. So, despite 2 resolutions by the Subcommission on the Prevention and Discrimination of Minorities, which condemned Iran for its flagrant and systematic violations of the human rights of the Baha'is, despite a resolution by the Commission on Human Rights at its 38th session condemning Iran and requesting the Secretary General to make contact with the Iranian government in an effort to, quote, ensure that the Baha'is are guaranteed full enjoyment of their human rights and fundamental freedoms, despite condemnation of Iran at its 38th session, at the 38th session of the Commission of Human Rights by Canada, the Netherlands, the United States, Australia, the Federal Republic of Germany, Italy, Denmark, the United Kingdom, Zambia, Belgium, Togo, Norway, and despite independent condemnation of Iran by the Canadian and Australian parliaments and the Council of Europe, Iran has outmaneuvered any legal proceedings that might have been taken against Iran by claiming, 1, Baha'is are a non-entity in Iran. They are not listed in Iran's constitution and are therefore not protected by Iran's constitution or any human rights documents which Iran may have signed. And 2, the Baha'is are politically disruptive and work, quote, against the higher interests of Iran. And in a world where nation-state sovereignty is the supreme principle, you cannot afford to allow anything that threatens that sovereignty. For human rights to become a reality, there must be more than an agreement that human rights are in principle good, and more than mere indignation at human rights violations. There must be a moral and legal commitment by nation-states to an objective definition of human rights and to an objective means of appraising human rights performance in municipal law that would be legally binding on all states. Nothing short of this kind of commitment will enable all men to enjoy the rights enumerated in the United Nations documents. The protection of human rights will remain ad hoc and after the fact, as in the case of the Baha'is in Iran, until states become so enamored with the ideal of human rights that they willingly give legal force to an international body empowered to define human rights and force compliance. Such a legal relationship between individual actors and a judiciary, as exists in municipal law, will exist in international law when the nation-states become physically and spiritually united, sharing a common culture, a common notion of what man is. The international expansion of commerce and industry has made the world a very much smaller place for individualistic nation-states. Physically, nation-states enjoy the physical proximity of municipal actors, but without the common law which makes peaceful municipal life possible. The standards to which states aspire and by which they judge one another are founded on various religious influences again. Where do they get these values? Where do they get these standards of behavior? While international interdependence can go a long way to enlighten perceptions, it cannot provide the values and assumptions with which international existence itself is understood. These are provided by cultural and religious prejudices. Thus, with states operating on different notions of what is good and what is bad in international existence, consensus is impossible. Human rights demand a common notion of what man is, but traditional religious presumptions and perceptions have always been local or regional, and consequently these presumptions have been overwhelmed by the moral complications of a politically and economically interdependent world. Traditionally, societies have been formed around the principle of exclusivity, where the interests of a chosen people were placed above the interests of other peoples. And in an underdeveloped world, a world of many physical frontiers and barriers, this principle was valuable. Indeed, it was necessary for the expansion and settlement of mankind. It was this belief in being a chosen people that was behind Abraham's search for the Promised Land. It was also behind the Crusades, the 17th century Puritan settlement of America, and the 19th century capitalist industrialization. But no more can holy wars be waged or expansion ventured for the sake of internal unity or exclusive benefit. Political and economic interdependence, nuclear weapons are too easily upset. All men must today be seen as chosen, and all men must enjoy their rights, traditionally reserved for those of like nationality. So that's what we need, and how do we get there? Everyone agrees that human rights are good. How do we instill in them the spirit of sacrifice, of willingness to give other people rights? The lack of a common sense of what man is, a common notion of human nature, has made the history of international concern for human rights haphazard and inconsistent. Another international lawyer, Moses Moskowitz, describes the history of international concern for human rights as pirouettes around a missing center. So what is that missing center? The development of the missing center that Moskowitz refers to requires a grand vision, a master plan which can incorporate the severality of religious and philosophic traditions in a common cause. And this is him, quote, "Surely this is a task which calls for prophets to proclaim and champions to defend. International concern for human rights still awaits this complex theoretician or visionary mind." Moskowitz is here outlining a theory of social change very similar to T.S. Kuhn's theory of scientific revolution, which is to say that he's claiming that there needs to be a person who can break the paradigm, who can jump beyond the constraints of the logic of a field in answer to fundamental problems and open up new areas and possibilities, as did Darwin for biology and Einstein for physics. So, beyond non-universal religious traditions, which everyone belongs to, which everyone today labors under, where does the new authoritative creative minority arise? Who will be the proponents of the new vision which Moskowitz calls for, but which neither he nor his colleagues have yet to offer? That which the Lord hath ordained for the sovereign remedy and mightiest instrument for the healing of all the world is the union of all its peoples in one universal cause, one common faith. This can in no wise be achieved except through the power of a skilled and all-powerful and inspired physician. That was Baha'u'llah. So stupendous a consummation in the collective life of the human race as would be the establishment of an international law and enforced human rights, would necessarily witness the consummation of all religious and political thoughts. So we've got a situation where we have spheres of religious and philosophic thought with no way to compromise with one another. We need something which incorporates them all. For it is the severality of religious and philosophic traditions which exist in isolation today that keeps mankind in disarray. Baha'u'llah writes, "There can be no doubt whatever that the peoples of the world of whatever race or religion derive their inspiration from one heavenly source and are the subjects of one God. The difference between the ordinances under which they abide should be attributed to the varying requirements and exigencies of the age in which they were revealed. All of them, except a few which are the outcome of human perversity, were ordained by God and are a reflection of His will and purpose. Arise, and armed with the power of faith, shatter to pieces the gods of your vain imaginings, the sowers of dissension amongst you." In answer then to these needs of an all-powerful physician and an all-encompassing faith, Baha'u'llah, referring to his revelation, declares in categorical language that, quote, "In this most mighty revelation, all the dispensations of the past have attained their highest, their final consummation." In the revelation of Baha'u'llah, The ancient covenant between God and man has been reaffirmed and restated in language appropriate to international existence. And in this covenant is the basis and standard for the covenants men create amongst themselves. In the Baha'i revelation are the standards, the criteria, the ideals which form the basis of the common culture necessary for human rights. The role of the Baha'i faith in this, then, is to provide the vision, to provide that believable answer to people who are stuck in these spheres of religious and philosophic traditions. It is not by negating or denying earlier principles of social life, but by taking these principles to their logical conclusion that the Baha'i revelation will win the hearts of men and provide the necessary spirit for the advent of international justice and human rights. Today, few ideals of social living. I want to read my favorite quote to you. The humanitarian and spiritual principles enunciated decades ago in the darkest East by Baha'u'llah and molded by him into a coherent scheme are one after the other being taken by a world unconscious of their source as marks of progressive civilization. And the sense that the old guidance will not carry it through the emergencies of the present has filled with uncertainty and dismay all thoughtful men, save those who have learned to find in the story of Baha'u'llah the meaning of all the prodigies and portents of our time. The coherent scheme is not as yet appreciated by the generality of men, who catch only partial glimpses of the vision of a unified contemporary moral philosophy. And without this coherent moral scheme, no coherent world order or law could possibly arise. So we have, what this quote says, is that we have humanitarian and spiritual principles taken by the world. Many people don't disagree with what the Baha'is say. No one's going to how could they disagree with good things like the unity of mankind and justice and such? It's they lack the coherent scheme. More importantly, they lack the belief in that. There's a very good program on the other night on TV. How's that for a scholarly paper, quoting TV? On the UN, and they're interviewing one fellow who was the chairman of the Human Rights Commission at the UN for a number of years. And there's really a sense of despair from him in his inability to actually do anything. He tried, he had very, very good ideals. The Charter of the UN is a very good document. And yet, he really despaired at the possibility of actually achieving this. So how do we as Baha'is answer this fellow's despair? To create the imperative to obey principles which subordinate individuality. Nothing has worked in history like the fear of God. The only thing that might humble the sovereign nation state today would be if they knew that God had spoken on the issue of international law and human rights. Indeed, what other authority could curb the belligerence of a sovereign nation state? Unaware of the all-powerful and inspired physician, one could only be filled with uncertainty and dismay. Moskowitz writes in this despair, the rejection of the requirements and the general interests of the human family for the sake of national advantage is expressed in an infinite variety of words and deeds. They are chronicled daily around the world and are deeply etched on the face of the earth. It is very rare that international cooperation is inspired and guided by principles which transcend all immediate consideration of national interest and of political and material advantage. This explains why all the grand designs for international peace have failed to blunt the sword, and why all international organization has brought us no nearer to world order and justice, unquote. The writings of Baha'u'llah re-establish God's covenant with man, the basis of all law, in terms appropriate to international existence. These writings establish the values, the principles, and the criteria of truth for a new level of social existence. But more than this, Baha'u'llah's writings provide the metaphor, the frame of mind, which allows men to view other religions and philosophic traditions as brothers. This metaphor, this vision, which is the Baha'i faith, does what no nationally derived legal construct can. It touches the hearts of men, moving men to make that willing commitment to strange and unfamiliar men, which international law and human rights demand. So this then is the job of the Baha'is. We are the creative minority, as it were. We have the vision and the conviction. We have that spirit that can give international law. No one else does. To be sure, everyone agrees with our principles, but the others lack the conviction and the purity of spirit. This is how the Baha'is can demonstrate the divine power of their ideas. Thank you.